Rampant Unknowns, the devilish details lurking behind the race to plant the first footprint on the moon. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace, President Nixon would somberly declare. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. As Nixon reviewed the contingency announcement written by his speechwriter, William Safire, he prayed he would never have to read it to a horrified television audience. He also knew, though, that there would be more than a few potential devils hiding in the details of the incredibly complex upcoming moonwalking mission that might compel him to deliver that mournful message. One of those devils didn't show itself until the astronauts had successfully walked on the moon's surface and re-entered their lunar module. Aldrin and Armstrong shifted around in the cramped environment, preparing to settle back for a few hours' rest before they lifted off the surface of the moon to rejoin Michael Collins in the orbiting command module. After they had shed their cumbersome backpacks, Aldrin curled up on the floor while Armstrong sat on the engine cover and leaned back to rest. In a split second, the priority of their lunar naps dropped to the bottom of their list. As Aldrin surveyed the cabin floor, he noticed something that obviously didn't belong there. A small black plastic switch for a circuit breaker. Apparently during movement, wearing our large spacesuit backpacks, Aldrin would later relate, either Neil or I bumped into this panel and broke off that particular switch. That particular switch, as fate would have it, was no minor control for a pilot light or a seat adjustment. Instead, it was required to connect the circuit to ignite the main engine for liftoff from the moon's surface. When the astronauts relayed the information to NASA's Mission Control Team, Houston's experts snapped into mental overdrive. They told Aldrin and Armstrong to try to get some sleep while they searched for an answer. But sleep didn't settle over the potentially stranded astronauts. As the Mission Control Team, 240,000 miles away, wrinkled their brows and rubbed their chins, Aldrin and Armstrong tried unsuccessfully to divert their thoughts. Perhaps there was an alternative method of reaching the vital circuit breaker the controllers considered, but nothing came to mind. Theoretically, they could configure the lunar module circuitry to ignite the engine by bypassing the circuit breaker. Theoretically. When morning came, the room full of anxious, exhausted scientists and technicians had still not concurred on a workable solution. Mission Control verified that the switch was open, meaning that the engine was currently unarmed. Buzz would summarize in his book Magnificent Desolation. If we could not get the engine armed, we could be stranded on the moon. Finally, combining a mixture of common sense and brute force, Aldrin contemplated jamming a writing pen into the opening left by the missing switch. His first thought was to use his specially designed Fisher anti-gravity pen. Then the notion crossed his mind that perhaps sticking a metal pin into an electric circuit breaker might not be the smartest idea. Instead, he employed an inexpensive plastic felt-tip pen that he had been using to take notes. Fortunately, the makeshift switch worked like a charm. I made a point to push it in hours before liftoff, Aldrin recalled, so we knew that it would actually stay in. At last, the rocket scientists back home could stop their brow wrinkling and chin rubbing. In the early afternoon of July 21st, two sleep-deprived but intensely relieved astronauts fired up their engine to leave their potential space prison behind. Although the memory of that little plastic pen nowadays brings a head shake and subtle smile to the faces of nostalgic former NASA personnel that was not their initial reaction back in the summer of 1969. They knew all too well that, as Neil Armstrong would later summarize, the unknowns were rampant. There were just 1,000 things to worry about. Those unknowns should have convinced any rational, level-headed person to simply gaze at the moon on a clear night and wonder what was up there, rather than risk unknown disaster to actually go there and find out. Throughout time, though, great mysteries have never been solved by rational, level-headed people. The roots of the desire to reach the mysterious sphere wind back past resourceful scientists, imaginative science fiction writers, and likely even a few contemplative cavemen. The spark, though, that would ignite the push, that would lead to Neil Armstrong's first lunar boot print, was struck in a joint session of Congress on May the 25th, 1961. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, President John Kennedy proclaimed in his now famous speech, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Of course, Kennedy's words didn't solve any of the rampant unknowns that Neil Armstrong would later reference, but they somehow seemed to transform them from a huge swirling cloud of nameless barriers into an equally huge but slightly less overwhelming cluster of challenges waiting to be solved. The question embedded in one of those challenges had already been answered a month before Kennedy's challenge. Could man actually survive in outer space? Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had successfully endured a suborbital flight into space aboard Vostok 1. Shortly after that, American astronaut Alan Shepard would duplicate the feat in a Freedom 7 spacecraft. These had been preceded by experimental launches of Astro dogs and monkeys, some successful and, sadly, some not. Despite the safe returns of Gagarin and Shepard, NASA knew they were only a few steps from the starting line of the extraordinary space race. The path from that starting line to the surface of the moon would be anything but a smooth passage. For a while it looked like Kennedy's words might be just that, simply words. Although they stirred the nation's pride, they didn't resolve the looming obstacles. The huge Atlas rockets were blowing up every day at Cape Canaveral, astronaut Jim Lovell recalled in a later documentary. Then, echoing the unspoken concern of every astronaut in training, he concluded, "It looked like a quick way to have a short career." Not only did rockets finally stop blowing up daily, but as the decade neared its end, enough successful tests and flights had transpired for NASA to actually decide it was time to fulfill President Kennedy's challenge. Millions of words have been written about the matchless drama of the first steps on the lunar soil. Those words, however, might have read like those in the morbid contingency speech President Nixon reviewed, had it not been for the most important components of the mission, the people inside the high-tech space gadgetry. With their quick thinking, expert flying skills, and a cheap felt-tip pen, those grown-up space travel dreamers turned potential tragedy into triumph. The culmination of that triumph was forever recorded on the customs and declarations forms they had to fill out for security following their return. Despite likely smirking a bit as they completed the routine bureaucratic form, all three of the lunar travelers felt a surge of pride as they reflected on the rampant unknowns they had conquered in order to fill the departure from section with 2 words: the moon. Rampant